So today's topic is general intelligence. And our discussion question for today is really, what does it mean to be smart? What makes humans intelligent? And how do we measure intelligence? So intelligence can be a somewhat complicated topic because there are multiple types, and we're going to get to that later. But most people, when they think of smart, they're usually thinking intelligence, although that might not always be the same. Some people can be smart in certain areas and maybe less so in other ones. So everyone's definition of smart may be a little bit different. But we get to explore a little bit about that in this lecture. First, we have an IQ test. I want you guys to pay attention. Okay, so what did you get? So now you guys got a very basic, very quick test that they said was designed to measure your intelligence. But do you think that it actually measured your intelligence? If not, what do you think it measured instead? I would gather, really, that this probably really didn't measure your intelligence. Mostly what it seemed to measure was, well, basically, a lot of that was book smarts. One of the questions was involved, being able to identify what country something was, the shape. And the thing is that while while that is very common knowledge in our culture, that's something you still were taught. A hunter-gatherer in another country maybe doesn't know that information. So does that mean that they're less intelligent than somebody in the US? Of course not. It's just showing that everybody has that there's a lot of things here that that we think, oh, has to be intelligence testing, but it's really not. It's actually testing knowledge, which is not always what we're looking for in intelligence. And a lot of those things actually really were more focused on stuff like verbal. There was some math in there, and a little bit of spatial as well. So that's really only part of what we should be testing, at least. That's only two types of intelligence, as we're going to learn later. So what might also need to be looked at in order to develop a better range, a fuller range of this intelligence? Most of those didn't really have that strong a problem-solving ability, but maybe something that was a little bit more like that. Some other might argue that maybe some type of musical stuff would be important as well. Just want you guys to think about what you would use if you were going to measure a full range of intelligence. Just be careful to make sure it's, when you come into a new idea, think of whether or not that actually does rely on knowledge as opposed to actual problem-solving ability. So what else would you do to measure it? Certainly there are these tests that are all written, but in the tests that you just took, as well as a lot of other tests realistically, a lot of things depend on the person's ability to read. So maybe that wouldn't be maybe if we had another thing, you could have some other ideas of how to measure intelligence that might be less dependent on reading. Perhaps for whatever reason somebody didn't read. They couldn't read. They whatever reason they grew up not illiterate. Until relatively recently, most people were illiterate. So to do an intelligence test that was reading based might be more problematic. So what else might you do to measure intelligence? Could you find a way to do it that doesn't involve reading, for example? So that's up to you guys. I want you guys to think about that when we go through the rest of this slideshow. So now we get to define intelligence, and intelligence really can be defined in many ways. We'll just go for an operational definition right now. But intelligence is that cognitive capacity to acquire, process, and recall information. Now, if you have taken read or listened to a lecture on like memory or learning, some of this might actually make sense to you, because memory has encoding, storage, and basically retrieval. So acquire is basically encoding. Process is not necessarily storage, but because this is more like the working memory part, where you're manipulating things. But recall is retrieval. Some of these words I'm not in love with. Acquire seems to sound really bad, because that makes me feel like I'm purchasing intelligence. Not quite it, but you are able to get the knowledge. I would just say get the knowledge in some way, whether it's oral, whatever. Acquire just makes me sound like you're purchasing intelligence. Not it. But you could get the knowledge however way you need to, process it however you need to do it, and also possibly store it, and then hopefully recall it in whichever way. Now, because there is that concept of recall, some people might say, wait a second, I've got a really bad memory. So does that mean I'm not intelligent? Well, while working memory and stuff like that is something that they do look at in intelligence tests, even if you don't have a great working memory, you might still, still have a lot of other things that will give you a normal IQ and, and ranking of intelligence. Talking about HM, who the poor case study, who had a really, really bad case of amnesia because really he had his whole hippocampus or most of his hippocampus removed and had no ability to tell you what just happened 2 seconds ago, basically. They were giving him IQ tests, and his were mostly coming up relatively normal. It just showed that he had a defect in his memory. So recalling is not the only thing that you have. As for how did we become intelligence? Well, there's this concept called social factors theory, and basically the long and the short of it is that we became intelligent because we had to be, because we were traveling in groups. And the more intelligent you are, the easier it is to manage however many people you're working, you're having to keep track of realistically. We know from work in anthropology that humans can basically hold up to about 400 relationships at any one time in their mind before they start losing it. They can keep track tit for tat for about 400 people. But and this is basically what's going on along with that general concept. Maybe before we could only keep track of 5 people, and then the more intelligence you go, the more people you can keep track of. I think a lot of this may come from observing animals, because a lot of the intelligent animals also are traveling in groups. Dolphins are very, very smart. They travel in a pod. Dogs, well, I should say wolves, often travel in a pack. So there is a social issue with all of those. Now, the question becomes, I have for this theory, is what came first, the chicken or the egg? Or did we get intelligent first and then were able to travel more in groups? Or were we traveling in groups first and then had to get more intelligent? So that's a question I think a lot of people have for this theory. But still, that is the theory that's going out there. That's up there somewhere. Another way that we're discussing intelligence is Spearman here. He was one of the first people that were really trying to define intelligence. He called this concept of general intelligence, the G factor. See, G for general. And he said that everybody has this G factor. Now, there's also another concept called an S factor, a specific factor, which means certain people have a better ability to do certain specific things than other things. I am not musical at all. My mother is. My mother has a bigger S factor when it comes to playing musical instruments, for example. So that's what that comes down to. I have a better S when it comes to certain types of problem solving, as opposed to that. So measuring intelligence, well, we have a lot of people who started to try to measure intelligence to get information. While Spearman came up with his G factor. Well, that's a great definition, but how do you measure a G factor? Well, these people tried to figure it out. First person up here was really Francis Galton. Now, he is a cousin of Charles Darwin, which I'm sure most of us are aware of. Now, he's a very interesting person. He was trying his damnedest to find out how to measure how smart people were. He looked at all sorts of things, most of which had nothing to do with intelligence. I'm not kidding. So Galton came up with ideas of, okay, well, let's look at all these different factors. Yeah, what could possibly influence intelligence? The man looked at stuff like grip strength. I am not a strong person. So telling me grip strength, yeah, to me that's completely unreal. But that's one of the things he looked at. He looked at pure strength, just ability to pick stuff up. By that definition, men are going to do better than women on average because most men are much stronger than women on average. But he looked at that. Another one he even looked at was the ability to distinguish colors. Now, that's interesting, but I'm not sure that has anything to do with intelligence. That has to do with, in part, how many code receptors are in your eye and if they're functioning. We discussed that in the lecture on sensation. So, but I'm serious. He did look at some of these things, and he was trying every single possible thing to find out what might have something to do with this factor. The only thing he really did contribute is that that intelligence has some type of heritability component. Okay, now he found that out by basically looking at people who went to Cambridge. Now, the interesting thing about people, especially back then, who went to Cambridge, is they also had relatives who went to Cambridge. Okay, so you looked at scholars, so they were intelligent, who had relatives who also went there, whose kids went there. Now, while we do know that intelligence does have a genetic component, it's somewhere around 0.5, and nurture is, so your environment's 0.5 as well. For the Cambridge thing, there seems to be other things that relate to that. There are probably way more confounding factors that have not, that are related to that, because I'm sure poor people who maybe could have been smart enough to get into Cambridge, maybe they couldn't afford to get into Cambridge, or maybe there's some type of legacy admissions to Cambridge. I don't know how they did that, but I'm sure there was something like that, because we had to do stuff to prevent that from happening in other places. But that's what he did. Now, Alfred Binet. Okay, so that name should vaguely sound familiar to some people, at least. Binet, anyway. He was working on something for basically classroom children. Basically, what happened was that his goal was to, around the time he was working, is when compulsory education basically showed up in France. That's what it comes down to. And he realized, okay, or somebody realized, that some kids had more knowledge and education than others. So he was really trying to find out, when he was building his test, is he wanted to find out which group needed more, maybe needed extra help. Let's see if I recorded this correctly. Okay, oh, well, I'm jumping ahead here, but that's okay. So, but he was trying to really assess who needs more help. There were a bunch of kids who had never been in school before, and there were other kids who'd been in school before. So he tried to figure out, like I said, simply who needed a little bit of extra help. And he partnered with Simon, or Simon partnered with Binet, whatever. And he created this first IQ test. Now remember, it's not truly measuring intelligence. The whole concept of it was, okay, so let's say this kid's in 5th grade. What should you know by the age of 10, by the time you're in 5th grade? At what point should you know this? What information should you know? So if this kid knew all the information, well, they didn't need the extra help. Obviously, they were fine. If there were people who were scoring, oh my God, they're missing these huge chunks, well, those are the kids who needed the extra help just to get them up to speed. this really, again, wasn't even a true measure of intelligence. It really was more close to, knowledge, if we wanted to get there. These kids were, probably, smart enough, but they didn't have the environment where they were being taught the information. So that's the only thing that this went through. That's how this B'nai Simon test actually started. So measuring intelligence. We have these three things. We did originally start with the intelligence quotient from B'nai Simon, which again was looking at who needed help. If a 10-year-old was performing at the level of the average 11-year-old, well, he didn't need help. That was his chronological age. That's how they said it, and his mental age. So his mental age was higher than his chronological age. He didn't need help. Now, if there was a 10-year-old who only knew the stuff that the 8-year-old was supposed to know, well, now he has an IQ of 80, basically mental age over chronological age times 100. So he needed a little bit of extra help. So that's what happened there. Now, B'nai eventually, partnered with Stanford. Actually, I think Stanford may have just taken over the stuff. It's kind of, can't really remember how that worked out. But Stanford basically took B'nai's stuff. Poor Simon got left off. And he kind of translated this to the US. This didn't go over nearly as well because now all of a sudden they're thinking they've totally separated it out from the original intention, and now you're at a point where they're trying to actually measure who is smart and who is not smart. Again, that wasn't the original intention of this. The original intention was to get people up to speed due to the compulsory education situation. So he really took this over into a different level. But back when with B'nai Simon and then to Stanford B'nai, they had this whole thing about this IQ score distribution. And see laser pointer. All right, let's see if the laser pointer works. So laser pointer, where they're saying somewhere around 90, which is roughly like here, to like 110 is basically average. And with this is one standard deviation. This is another standard deviation. So they're saying 68% of people should fall plus or minus one standard deviation from the mean. So that's these people. So these are the people that are just slightly don't quite, slightly not, slightly lower end of 100, slightly above. Actually, that ends at 115. And this is 68%. Then we're looking at another standard deviation below and below. And this is really comes into play, and here is above and above. This is what really comes into play with Stanford B'nai. All these things were used to partially pathologize people and to tell people what they, basically to lock some people away in some cases, not to get them up to speed, but to say this is a definitive measure of how smart you are or how dumb you are. Anytime you have probably ever heard a term used to describe somebody who is not so smart, or maybe truly mentally challenged, those actually all were medical terms originally to describe different categories here. Stuff like something that's really a really common phrase to talk to another person. I'm not going to use some of the worse off ones, but like just saying someone's an idiot. That is actually a medical term from, I can't remember where they are on this lower end. But in the geniuses, I think a lot of people know where. But when Stanford B'nai that information came to this country, and they started to do this IQ score distribution, this this was used in a kind of a crappy way. First of all, it was used on immigrants to decide whether or not they were going to come into this country or not. Now, the thing is that they didn't translate this into another language more often than not. They did these tests under crappy conditions, not standardized conditions that you're supposed to take them under. And they used these judges, these scores, to decide if this person is to come into the country or not. Now, this was a test that was biased. It was a test that was frequently in English, and you have just bad situations. And if you scored too low, you would be shipped back to your country of origin. This is literally how people were doing this. Now, that means the only people that were allowed to come in were usually already spoke English and had reasonable intelligence. Because they had reasonable social, they knew what they were supposed to know at whatever ages. So, because they were part of that culture. Stanford Binet also got used with Army officers when they were shipping people off for World War I, II, whatever. They made everybody take these stupid tests, and they tried to decide where you were going based on your scores. They maybe would test 100 people at a time in a crowded room where they were sitting on the floor writing on a chair to fill out this form. By the way, not how you're supposed to do this intelligence test. Stanford Binet, like I said, had a lot of cultural biases going in, but it remained a very, very popular test for a very, very long time. This next test is really more likely what you're going to take if you ever do take an intelligence test. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, they also have one that's for children. So if you're under, I think, 16, I think they give you the children. I think they give you an adult if you're over than that, if I'm remembering correctly. Now, this test still has challenges. I know because I've taken this test before. It still does test a lot of knowledge that you should have learned. Quote unquote, let's air quote that. But they do have a lot of things that are a little bit more culture fair, but it's still not ideal either. But that is a fairer form of testing than what the Stanford Binet was. For the Stanford Binet, it was not an unusual thing to ask. And here was a question that was on an IQ test I took. How many innings are in a tennis game? I was a very poor mixed race kid from a very poor neighborhood. I didn't know what tennis was. That's the type of questions that would be on the Stanford Binet. I said, I don't know what that is. I didn't know what tennis was until middle school or high school. So sometimes they'd ask about cricket too, and I was like, you mean the bug? You know. But Wechsler is a little bit better with that. Usually if they're going to ask you questions, it's going to be stuff that you really should have been taught in school. In the US, if you are in another country, they will give you a version that's basically hopefully in the correct language for that. Stanford Binet didn't really have that when that was at its peak. Measuring intelligence, part 2. Yet another slide on multiple intelligence. Okay, so this whole measuring intelligence situation, just like your SAT, your GRE, all of this is standardized. So you really do have specific questions that get asked to everybody. Now, it is also that being said, it also has to get normed. This IQ distribution, it gets normed every few years. The entire test gets revamped every so often. I think it was I was told it was every 10 years. I'm not really sure if that's accurate, but I think I was told like every 10 years or something like that. So they look at the entire test, they remove questions, put new questions in, update things. So, and then they test everything to make sure that this bell curve still is as it should be. Now, when they're removing things and putting new things in, it's frequently because either maybe the culture has changed a little bit. You know, for example, maybe they had a question in the 60s or 70s. Maybe they had a question about records, like the big black things that spun. Now, maybe it was something with that. Maybe in the 90s they had a question about CDs or DVDs. How much can a CD hold, or something like that. Now that's an update. Nowadays they have a little more questions about more science questions actually. But every so often they do, like I said, renorm the thing to take into account different changes in what we think is appropriate to be tested. Maybe some questions we thought were culture fair back then, maybe we find out now maybe that there's a huge bias. Maybe certain groups of people just aren't exposed. So they remove it and try to replace it with something better. So every 10 years they revamp the whole thing. They take 1,000 people or however many thousand people, redo it, and try to get a distribution to come back. Now, that being said, because it does get changed every few years, and it's always renormed on the younger generation, generally, or basically because it's just the way culture works and technology works, that there ends up with this thing called like the Flynn effect. And the idea of this Flynn effect is basically as you get older and you take a new IQ test, your IQ score is going to tend to be lower. That doesn't really mean that you're getting stupider or anything like that, because they don't always, once you get past a certain point, they're just renorming you in comparison to all of the adults, not always the adults in your cohort. So if you say take a test, an IQ test when you're 20, and then you take it when you're 30, and then you take it when you're 40, maybe you have 130, then you got 125, then you got 120, and you keep dropping like that. That's an example of the Flynn effect. I was a victim of the Flynn effect. I one time was taking a test, and it showed my IQ dropped like 20 points. And it was like, what? And the poor clinical psychologist who actually I get to talk to in a few days, he had to remind me, he's like, remember, things were renormed. You were, as far as your pure intelligence, you should probably just go by what you were the first time, because we're actually looking at other things on this test right now. But no, you don't have to give up like your Mensa membership, because it was the original one probably was the most appropriate score. You're just dropping points because of the Flynn effect. Luckily, I knew what the Flynn effect was, so that didn't reduce my anxiety that much. But it's still, one of those things. Now, IQ tests are not without their controversy. They usually only test a few types of intelligences, usually verbal and math. It's huge. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of spatial, but it's usually verbal and math. There are a lot of other intelligences going out. They tend to be culturally biased. Like I said, I didn't know what a tennis court was, because things are usually normed on a norm to upper middle class people in New England who are white. So there's that. Maybe it'll ask you about clam chowder. Well, the South might not know how to make it. So the cultural bias is certainly are something important to note. There's this whole situation of nature versus nurture, the ongoing debate. Because we do know that intelligence is a factor, but it's not the only factor. You also have to have a decent environment in which you can do and show your intelligence to, and you need to have it nurtured as well. Then there's also this concept of eugenics. So eugenics is a thing that still pops up. And I want to point out that eugenics is responsible for a lot of damage, and it's still, like I said, it really is still popping up. usually when people think of eugenics, they're thinking back in Hitler's days, and when he was trying to purge and get rid of the Jews and other groups of people. And it turns out he was not the first person to do that. He was certainly not the last. In Romania, the Gypsies, which is the non-PC term, they prefer to use the term Rom or Romany, but I wanted to introduce the other term so you actually knew what it was. Lovely people, but they got really screwed in Romania I want to say it was the 19th century, where all the males got castrated, so to reduce the population, in part. And I know it sucked, and and that was before Hitler came on the scene. When Hitler showed up, rose to power in the 30s and the 40s, he a lot of people think he started with the Jews. He in fact didn't. He started with people that had intellectual disabilities and other forms of disabilities. So he first took those people, took them out, and eventually then moved on to deciding that the Jews were an inferior group, and they killed off them. And the Romani, who they tried to kill off as many of them as possible. But although it's also eugenics, but it all really did start with intelligence. And even now, it is starting to play into effect even in the U.S. But for a very long time, people thought, oh, the U.S. really didn't have that much, until it started affecting poor white women. That's when they're like, oh, wait a second. Now, this has already been done to people of color for a while. Hispanic women, African American women. I think they did similar to the Native American women. I think they did, but all those groups are very much targeted for eugenics, and we never even think of it as that. An example of people in fairly recent times experiencing basically a eugenics movement is under President Trump. We had a whole bunch of people that were pulled that were trying to come into the country with questionable legal status, put them into camps, and a lot of the women, there were several women that were told they had cancer, did not have cancer, or maybe only had cancer in maybe an ovary or something like that, and they were forced to undergo a hysterectomy so that they wouldn't. So in theory, they said to get rid of the cancer. A lot of them turned out did not have cancer, and here's the craziest thing about it: the people who were even performing those surgeries weren't even licensed OBGYNs or licensed physicians. Figure that one out. I don't understand that, but it might be because most of the doctors probably wouldn't have done it anyway. But that's an example of eugenics, right now, and that just happened. I'm recording in 2021. That happened, I believe, summer 2020. So that being said, lower people with lower socioeconomic status do tend to have lower scores. So that goes along with that. They also tend to be minorities. Organizations, some of them have lower or upper limit on intelligence, one of which is the police. There were a lot of lawsuits because people were told they were too intelligent to be a cop because they scored over like a few of them were Mensa members, and a few of them just scored over 110. So that's kind of disturbing. I can understand the lower limit, but the upper limit for something like that is disturbing. But it is something to note. Regardless of that lower limits, there is still a pressure to boost scores. Some people are taking what are called nootropics. A very famous nootropic is actually Ritalin and Adderall. They can be used in that way because really they're designed for people who have a bad attention span to actually just let them perform at a normal level. Normal person takes it, they might boost their scores because the focus is better. So there still is that pressure to boost those scores. And that's one of the concerns that people have regarding all that. As far as your boosting intelligence, a joke. Two policemen are walking through a park. See how a young man is putting an apple core in a plastic bag. He then takes another apple, eats it, puts the core in his bag again. So they approach him. Excuse me, why do you return the apple cores back into the plastic bag when there's a garbage bin next to you? He says, when I get home, I'll take the apple seeds out of them and eat them. Boosts my intelligence. Is that true? Well, if you want, you can have these 2 apple cores for $4. So they buy them and eat them. An hour later, one of them says, dude, we're stupid. We bought 2 apple cores for $4. We'd have been able to buy 3 pounds of apples. The other replies, oh my God, it works. Ba-dum-bump. Sorry. So now we get into a little more about types of intelligence. So Carroll created this model thinking that maybe there were multiple levels of intelligence that over time led up to this whole concept of this G. If you look in level 1, you've got stuff like fluency, verbal comprehension, foreign language aptitude, which means I'm pretty much screwed. I've got none of that. There's also level 2, where you're looking at fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence, various forms of speed, various forms of perception. And then at the top, you have this level of G. So two other psychologists came up with wanted to expand some of this, and they came up with this. They did some work on fluid and crystallized. Basically, what fluid and crystallized are is basically that the fluid intelligence is what is basically this concept of basically new situations. Can you apply what you know to new situations? It's very, very fluid. And crystallized is that already memorized stuff, that you already know over time. You've been taught it. Maybe your experience, maybe something else, your books, your education, whatever. So usually the elders, I want to say old people because I'm rapidly reaching that age, but the older people do tend to have better crystallized intelligence just because they have more experience. The younger people frequently have to rely more on their fluid intelligence, their problem-solving ability to deal with something in a new situation that they may not have seen much of before. So that's what that basically realistically comes down to. So let's do this really quick concept check over whether it's fluid, so new situation, probably, or crystal, which is probably based on stuff that you already know. Navigating a subway system in a new city. Is it fluid or is it crystallized? Technically speaking, this one could actually be either. It is more fluid because it's a new city, but the very, very basics of navigating a subway system, well, that's probably based on your experience, so that part might be a little bit crystallized, but for the most part it's fluid, but it could go either way. Knowing Budapest is the capital of Hungary. If you said this was crystallized intelligence, you're correct. Solving an algebra problem. Technically, this one can also be either fluid or crystallized. The very, very basics of your procedure of what you know about how to solve an algebra problem, well, that's more crystallized. But the algebra problem itself, unless you've happened to seen that problem before, it might be a newer problem. So that part is more likely to be more fluid. Baking cookies from memory. That is crystallized. And how about playing a video game? Fluid or crystal? while there is the basic controls that you have to memorize is probably more crystallized, the video game itself will tend to be more fluid. But it can be a little bit either way, but it is mostly fluid. There's also this concept of emotional intelligence, which we don't really hear about nearly as much as we probably should, but that is the ability to basically manage your emotions as well as help other people with basically with theirs, kind of. I'm trying to say that anyway. So now I'll give you an example of why this might be more important. So we know that engineers have an average IQ of somewhere around 115. So if you become an engineer, let's make the assumption that your IQ is at least 115. It's not going to matter, that much probably either way. But 115, so you're in there. So you all have similar normal IQ levels. But who is more likely to get a promotion? It's probably going to be somebody who has a decent emotional intelligence, if not a super high one. And emotional intelligence comes down to things like, this concept of self as well as social, which is with other people, your ability to recognize what's going on, and the ability to help regulate other people. So self-awareness, how you feel about yourself, your emotions, your confidence level. Too much self-confidence is bad, just so you know. How you control yourself, so no outbursts. True facts. I have a friend who is a leader in an organization I'm a member of, and he had a interesting situation. He was trying to resign from a certain post, and basically he had a very, very large emotional outbreak, and he lost his position, which, in all fairness, is what he wanted anyway. But that he no longer had self-control, so he lost his position. So there's that. So be careful if you deal with that. Always have good self-management. Social recognition, empathy is very, very important. If, let's say you're in a situation, and let's say one of your coworkers has a relative who passes away, you showing empathy towards them might not have an immediate payoff, but it does show that you have high emotional intelligence, and that might very well be remembered down the line, especially if that's something like, maybe the boss or whatnot. Certainly that they'll notice that more, assuming they don't think it's like a suck-up thing. But showing empathy is usually a good thing to do, and that's the social recognition, being aware that other people are in an uncomfortable spot. Relationship management, how well you can deal with teamwork, leadership, and influence others. All that's also an important part of emotional intelligence. So you should learn more about emotional intelligence if you can. So there's also different types of intelligences. Again, we're going to go on more into this one down on whenever on the next my other intelligence lecture. But I would really recommend learning about one of these multiple intelligence tests. This is a link you can't see, but I give it to my class. I'll put the link in the recording down in the comments, but it's from literacynet.org, saying find your strengths for the Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So Gardner's theory's got 8. Actually, they have 9, but most people just talk about the 8, which is logical math, visual spatial, music, verbal linguistics, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. And these are all very, very important types of intelligences, some of which don't get discussed nearly as much. And I am going to be talking about this more. There's also a 9th type of intelligence that we did. So let's move on to the next one. Another thing that people need to consider when they deal about this whole concept of intelligence is actually that mindset can be more important than intellectual abilities. Somebody who has a negative mindset, might be putting a constraint on what they can and can't do. Meanwhile, somebody who has decent confidence in what they can do, a very positive mindset, will continue to do things even if their intellectual abilities may not necessarily mean that they could do it as well or as easily. And that's something that's going to be discussed in a different lecture. So I want you guys to think about the following question. What factors do you think contribute to intelligence? Pause this video for a second and think, and then when you're ready to restart, hit play. So there are several factors that do contribute to intelligence or perceived intelligence. One of them is genetics. We know that roughly 0.5 as far as genetic how much genetics contributes to intelligence. We know this based on the twin studies that identical twins have very similar intelligences, and it contributes, and it's about 0.5. The other is environmental factor, which is another 0.5. So genetics is a factor. A positive attitude can be a huge factor. And in a positive attitude, you may continue working harder at a problem. It's stuff like having more grit. But an example of how a negative attitude can contribute. When my kid was 6 years old, she took an IQ test. She was doing really, really well until she got to a certain point. And then she just stopped. She actually had gotten a perfect score until that stopped, and she wouldn't continue on because she had self-doubts. And she probably would have, her score was fine. But she could have gotten a higher score. But she doubted herself, and she didn't want to try in the off chance she failed or got points off. So she had a hard stop. Her IQ at that point was 120. If she continued on, she probably could have hit 130 because it was a perfect score. But she had a bad attitude, so she didn't contribute. She had a positive attitude, she would have continued off. Likewise, if you have a hard problem that's coming up, sometimes it's better to at least continue to try to think outside the box a little bit. People will certainly think you're more intelligent, and usually in some of the harder intelligence tests that maybe aren't timed, they don't really care how you solve the problem, provided you do. There's some issues a little bit with gender differences. However, it's really not, most things aren't hugely statistically significant. Certain things women do a little bit better on than men. We'll get to that in a second, although it all evens out fairly well. But that is an issue. Unequal representation. So unequal representation, this does fall a little bit with the attitude as well. But if a group of people is better represented, first of all, even in their in a specific job or specific, even when testing the stupid tests, if your person, your group of people is represented in a field, you're more likely to have a better attitude and be able to get into that field. So I guess you can say that maybe that's more of a confounding variable, but certainly that falls under correlation too. So for a very long time, women were not scientists. They weren't allowed to do it. And for generations, they were told they couldn't do it. Now there's more women that are available in STEM professions, and the representation still not 100% equal, but it's getting better. And so now more women are striving, more women are getting, okay, I can do that, positive attitude, which means they're showing better as far as the intelligence in those particular areas that are needed. Similar concept with people of color. So representation is important, guys. It is. There's also this interesting concept called the stereotype threat, and that really pops up more into a different module. But this concept of a stereotype threat is that you're going to basically blend in really with the stereotypes set forth for your group. So that can cause problems in certain cases, maybe not problems in certain cases. Like Asians, for example, have this stereotype of being very, very mathematical, and maybe this will help them be more mathematical. That group of people, that would be, it's kind of like a pressure. Maybe another group, maybe they say, because women used to be thought of as being really, really bad in like math. So maybe a woman who actually is good at math actually is pulling back her abilities so that she can blend in. So that's kind of more of like what that stereotype threat is. You're trying to blend in with the stereotypes that other people give, so that so that it's not so you don't come off kind of like as a real threat to others. You fit into a nice box. That basically comes down to. There's also concept of bias that kind of goes in with the representation, then the stereotype threat, and biases. There have been biases against basically everybody that isn't a straight white male, straight white Christian male, basically in this country, and so that's probably not a surprise. Correlative intelligence. Who's smarter, men or women? So I'll just say right now, women will probably say women. The smart men will either say women, or then the smartest men will say nothing at all. So just putting that out there. But we can argue with this for eons. So who's smarter, men or women? Well, so here, when I talked about the correlation of the different genders, I'm still not sure if they're talking about gender or sex, because to me this sounds more like sex, but what do I know? Anyway, so correlates of intelligence of females more likely to do better with the fine motor skills, the acquired knowledge, better reading comprehension, and nonverbal expressions, and will tend to do better grade-wise. Males, better with fluid reasoning with math and science, perceptual tasks, and transformations in working memory. Some of this would make sense when you realize this whole concept of hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherers, women, yes, sometimes in some cultures they also did the hunting too, but the big, huge hunting, huge things were usually the males who were going off and doing that. So they had to venture potentially far. They had to be able to track down and trick huge animals into basically dying so they can get food. Women were a little bit closer to home. They had to store a whole lot of information. They certainly did a lot of the gathering. Men did some of the gathering too. And they may have done very, very basic hunting around the area, usually the smaller game. They did frequently a lot of the crafts that needed to be done. So some of this could be easily to explain just in that context. Interestingly, if you talk about the trans population, depending on what trans group you see, because there's male to female and female to male. Well, the female to male are certainly all over the place, and usually the male to female are a little bit less all over the place, but they still cross. I mean, this is just an example anyway, but a lot of the female to males do fairly well with acquired reading comp and grades. Usually not so much here, usually not so much there, and usually are over do have at least better reasoning with the math science and at least spatial stuff. Not everybody does, but I would love to see some actual studies on this, but they haven't done a lot of very, very advanced stuff, only very, very basic stuff. So if you are ever also curious about other interesting things about the males and females, women will tend to have closer to average IQs. But the thing is that that's mostly because so many people pay attention to males that males are 4 times more likely to score on either end of the IQ thing, either super low or super high. And part of that could be due to female socialization, as well as various other factors. Women are a little bit more likely to try to blend in. So that's also why a lot of women that have disabilities may fly under the radar for a very long time. So that's that there. Now that we've discussed intelligence, you have some additional questions, some of which I already kind of answered in this lecture. So how would you define intelligence? How would you measure it? I covered that. Is eugenics going on today? I covered that a little bit too, at least as of 2021. So some people say there are many geniuses born around the world, but they can't reach their full potential because they live in a poor country. Do you agree? Do you think we can create artificial intelligence? And if scientists could put a chip in your head that would make you twice as intelligent, would you have the surgery done? So those are some questions to think about and to ask. If you have any questions for me, you can certainly send me an email, drop me a comment, something like that, and I will do my best to help you. Thank you. Have a good day.